The peasants' cries echoed across the valleys like a low, unending thunder, the kind of sound that made even the kings glance nervously toward their castle walls. The Middle Ages were never kind to the weak, but rebellion was a sin carved from madness. For a peasant to raise a hand, a pitchfork, or even a voice against his lord was to invite a punishment so cruel, so deliberate, that it seemed crafted not by man, but by something darker. Imagine the smell of wet earth mixed with smoke, the thatched roofs of villages burning while knights rode through the streets, cutting down anyone who dared to run. This wasn't war, it was correction. A message. The crown didn't simply crush rebellion, it made a spectacle of it. Heads displayed on spikes, bodies left to rot at crossroads, the air thick with fear and rot, all to remind the living of one unbreakable truth. The king's will was divine, and disobedience was blasphemy. But beneath the soot and blood, there was something else, something the nobility could never truly destroy. Whispers spread faster than fire, tales of injustice, of starving families, of taxes that strangled the soul of the land. The peasants began to realize that the crown's gold was minted from their bones, and once that truth took root, no amount of fire could burn it away. Across England, France, and the German principalities, the same question rose like smoke from the ashes. What happens when the ones meant to serve finally refuse to kneel? The answer, history tells us, was written in screams. As you watch this tale unfold, ask yourself, how far can the human spirit be pushed before it breaks, or fights back? If this dark corner of history fascinates you, leave a comment below. Would you have rebelled, or bowed your head in silence? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that uncover the brutal truth of our past. The rebellion did not begin with swords, it began with hunger. Beneath the golden halls of kings, the land itself was bleeding. Harvests failed, and when they didn't, the taxes devoured them before a single grain reached the peasants' tables. A man could work from sunrise to nightfall and still watch his children starve, their bellies swelling not from food, but from emptiness. The medieval system was designed with cruelty in its bones. Feudal lords claimed divine right, but their divinity was measured in how much pain they could impose. For every field plowed, a tax. For every child born, a tithe. Even death offered no relief. The mortuary fee demanded payment before burial, as if the soil itself required rent. The church blessed this structure, calling obedience a virtue and suffering a path to heaven. In truth, it was a leash. Peasants were not simply poor. They were trapped within a cycle engineered to keep them crawling. Their homes were not their own, their lives not their own. And yet, behind the dull eyes and bowed heads, resentment brewed like a fever. The plow became a symbol of servitude, but also of resistance. Each seed planted beneath the king's tax collectors carried a whisper of rebellion. In the villages, people began to speak, quietly, at first. Around hearths, in barns, behind church walls. They spoke of justice, of equality, of a world not ruled by men born into crowns. The more the whip cracked, the more those whispers turned into a rhythm, the rhythm of a storm forming beyond the horizon. It was not one event, but a slow rot spreading through Europe's feudal heart. The monarchs did not see it coming, blinded by the glitter of their own excess. They believed fear eternal, but fear, once overused, loses its power. And what was left beneath it, despair, rage, hunger, would soon ignite the kind of fire no throne could extinguish. When rebellion reached the ears of the crowned, it was not heard as defiance. It was heard as an insult. To challenge a king was to defy God himself. And kings of the Middle Ages did not respond with diplomacy. They responded with rage dressed in armor. In the royal courts, messengers delivered word of uprisings, villages refusing taxes, peasants arming themselves with scythes and hammers. The monarchs' faces twisted, not with fear, but with fury. It wasn't the loss of gold that drove them mad. It was the loss of control. For centuries, they had been worshipped as living embodiments of divine order. Now that illusion cracked, and they would crush anyone who dared look through it. Armies were summoned, banners unfurled, not for war between nations, but for war against their own people. Thousands of knights and mercenaries descended upon the countryside, like wolves loosed into a pen of lambs. The punishment was swift, unrelenting, and deliberately theatrical. Villages were burned to ash, rebels hanged by the hundreds, and leaders quartered, their limbs displayed as warnings on city gates. The message was simple. The king's mercy ends where his authority is questioned. But this fury went deeper than vengeance. It was ritualized terror, an art form perfected by monarchs who understood that violence, when performed publicly, was the strongest chain of all. The screams of peasants were not only punishment, they were propaganda. Each death was a sermon on loyalty, each display of brutality a reminder that even thinking of rebellion was treason. And yet, within that fear, something unexpected began to grow. The kings believed they had broken the spirit of the common people, but in truth they had revealed their own fragility. The peasants saw the cruelty not as divine punishment, but as proof of a system built on blood and arrogance. For the first time they glimpsed the truth hidden behind the crown, that kings bled like any other man. The wrath of kings could destroy bodies, but it could not erase the idea now spreading from one terrified heart to another, that even thrones can burn. The morning air was heavy, thick with anticipation and the stench of blood. Crowds gathered not out of curiosity but obedience. They knew what was coming, and they knew they had to watch. In the medieval world, public executions were not merely justice, they were theater. A performance meant to carve fear deep into the bones of all who witnessed it. In the town square stood the gallows, a stage upon which rebellion met its end. Peasants accused of uprising were paraded through the streets, their faces beaten, their families forced to march behind them. Drums thundered, as royal guards read aloud the crimes: treason, defiance, blasphemy. The condemned were often innocent of all three. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the spectacle. Kings and nobles understood the psychology of terror better than any tyrant since. To rule by sword was costly. To rule by fear was eternal. The body of one rebel could silence 1,000 living souls. That was the calculus of the crown. So they devised punishments not just to kill, but to unmake. Men were hanged and cut, down while still alive, their stomachs open before a crowd of trembling villagers. Some were boiled, some flayed, some broken on the wheel. Women accused of harboring traitors were stripped and branded, their pain a warning for all who dared pity the defiant. The executioners, cloaked, masked, and almost ritualistic, became instruments of divine vengeance. Each swing of the axe, each snap of bone, echoed the king's decree. This is what rebellion costs. Children were brought to watch, to learn that obedience was survival. And when the final cries faded, and the crowd dispersed in silence, the real punishment began: the memory. The people carried that horror back to their homes, passing it down through generations as ghost stories whispered by firelight. But fear, when stretched too long, begins to tear. The spectacle that once enforced order also planted seeds of hatred. Behind bowed heads, fists clenched. Behind tears, anger burned quietly. The kings believed the people were broken. They did not realize they had simply gone quiet, the way a storm does before it returns. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in that time, would you have watched or looked away? Long before the flames died out in the rebellion's aftermath, the kings discovered a punishment even crueler than death: humiliation. To kill a man was simple, but to strip him of dignity, to reduce him to a symbol of mockery, ensured that his legacy would rot long before his body did. In the Middle Ages, this was not a side effect of punishment. It was the goal. Captured rebels were paraded through towns tied to horses, their faces smeared with filth, their hair torn out in clumps. Before execution, Many were forced to beg forgiveness from their rulers, publicly on their knees, as the crowd jeered. The church often stood beside the throne, sanctifying the ritual with prayers and chants. To the peasants, it was a sermon. To the crown, it was theater. The humiliation did not end with the condemned. Their families were marked with infamy. Wives and daughters were dragged before the villagers, stripped of honor, sometimes of clothing, forced to confess sins they never committed. The children of rebels were labeled as cursed, denied land, marriage, or inheritance. The punishment was designed to echo, generation after generation, until rebellion itself became synonymous with shame. Even the corpses of the executed were not spared. Bodies were dismembered, their remains nailed to church doors or left to rot on pikes outside castle gates. The message was clear. Rebellion did not end at death. It haunted the living. The king's justice was a curse that outlived the condemned. Humiliation was a weapon that seeped into the soul. It told every peasant watching that resistance would not only kill them but erase them. To fight back meant losing not only one's life, but one's name, one's family, one's place in memory. It was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. And yet, the kings underestimated one thing. Humiliation, when suffered in silence too long, can transform into something far more dangerous than anger. It becomes memory sharpened into vengeance. The peasants, beaten and broken, learned to wear their shame like armor. And in time, the kings would learn that no crown shines forever. History remembers the kings, the wars, the thrones drenched in blood, but it forgets the cries of those who dared to rise and were erased for it. Across medieval Europe, countless peasant uprisings flickered like dying candles, briefly illuminating the darkness before being snuffed out by royal decree. Yet even in their defeat, those forgotten rebellions whispered truths the crowns tried to bury. In England, before the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381, there were smaller fires, villages refusing to pay new taxes, fields left unharvested in protest, priests who preached equality instead of obedience. In France, the Jacquerie, a desperate uprising of farmers, was crushed with such brutality that even chroniclers described the slaughter with trembling pens. In the German lands, local revolts erupted like sparks, each one extinguished before it could spread. The names of those who led them have vanished, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced. But their suffering laid the groundwork for every rebellion that followed. These uprisings shared one thing in common: hope, born from despair. They were not orchestrated by generals or nobles, but by common men and women, exhausted, starving, and betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. They fought with tools, with stones, with whatever their trembling hands could hold. They knew they would lose, but they fought anyway, believing that even a doomed act of defiance could stain the conscience of their oppressors. The kings and their chroniclers made sure their names were forgotten. Official records described them not as rebels, but as heretics, criminals, beasts. Language, designed to strip away humanity. Their villages were burned, their families enslaved, their histories rewritten. Yet, through the centuries, fragments of their struggle survived in folklore. Ghost stories of cursed lands, songs of hidden heroes, murmurs of vengeance carried by the wind. To study these forgotten rebellions is to glimpse the heartbeat of the medieval world, the quiet, relentless pulse of people who refused to stay silent even when the world demanded it. Their defiance may have been erased from parchment, but it endures in spirit, haunting every monument to royal glory with the faint echo of chains breaking. For generations after the rebellions, fear hung over the peasantry like a permanent shadow, invisible but crushing. It was in the silence that followed curfews, in the cautious glances exchanged when a night rode by, in the quiet prayers whispered before sleep. Fear became part of daily life, passed down like inheritance. It was the crown's most perfect weapon. It required no soldiers, no gallows, no chains. It lived inside the people themselves. The monarchs knew this. They didn't need to burn every village to maintain control. They only needed to burn enough. The memory of horror did the rest. Parents told their children to obey, not because it was right, but because disobedience meant death. Songs about rebellion were forbidden, and even the mention of past uprisings could bring suspicion. The people began to censor their own thoughts. Tyranny had reached the mind. In time, this fear took on a spiritual weight. The church, bound to the crown, taught that rebellion was not only treason but a sin against God. The peasants came to see their suffering as divine punishment, their misery as a test of faith. The executioner's blade was the hand of heaven, the king's command, holy law. This was how oppression became eternal, not by the sword, but by belief. And yet, even under this suffocating dread, the human heart continued to resist in small, defiant ways. Some refused to bow deeply enough when the Lord passed. Others sang forbidden verses in the fields when they were sure no one could hear. These were not open revolts, but quiet acts of rebellion, the only ones left possible. But fear, once absorbed too deeply, changes people. It reshapes how they see the world, how they raise their children, how they define themselves. Centuries later, the echoes of that fear still linger in the collective memory of nations that once knelt beneath iron crowns. The peasants were told to forget, but fear does not forget. It evolves. If you lived in that age, could you truly keep silent? Or would the weight of fear eventually crush you? Tell me in the comments below. In the medieval world, no alliance was darker or more powerful than that between the church and the crown. Together they ruled not only the bodies of men, but their souls. Kings wielded swords, priests wielded salvation, and when rebellion threatened the order of things, both worked hand in hand to sanctify its destruction. The church preached that all power came from God, and therefore, to defy the king was to defy heaven itself. Sermons echoed from cathedrals and village chapels alike. Obedience was holy, rebellion was damnation. The message seeped into every corner of life. Peasants were told that their suffering purified them, that poverty was divine design, that the meek would inherit the earth, but not today, not while the Lord still walked it. When uprisings flared, the church did not stand as a voice of mercy. Instead, it lent its blessing to the sword. Papal decrees branded rebels as heretics, and inquisitors followed armies to cleanse the land. Monasteries turned into prisons, confessionals into interrogation rooms. Priests accompanied executioners, offering last rites to those who dared defy both God and king, a ritual that sanctified cruelty in the name of righteousness. But faith is a double-edged weapon. In the same way the church used Scripture to justify oppression, the oppressed began to twist those same words into calls for justice. All men are equal before God, some whispered, too softly for priests to hear. Then why are kings not equal before men? These quiet heresies grew in the dark corners of Europe, kindling the earliest flames of spiritual rebellion. Still, for most of the Middle Ages, the union between throne and altar remained unbreakable. The crown needed legitimacy, the church needed protection. Together, they constructed a system that enslaved both body and spirit, and branded submission as virtue. It was not only the sword that kept the people bowed, it was the fear of eternal fire. And so, under the watchful eyes of both heaven and earth, the peasants worked, prayed, and suffered, believing that their pain pleased God. It was the perfect tyranny, one that reached beyond life itself. They were the hands of the king's justice, the ones who turned royal decrees into screams. Executioners stood at the edge of morality, neither fully condemned nor accepted, feared by peasants, despised by nobles, yet indispensable to both. In a kingdom ruled by fear, they were the machinery that kept terror alive. Most were not born into the role, they were forced into it. Criminals spared from death, men with no trade but strength, or those shunned by their own kind. They lived on the outskirts of towns, their houses marked, their children isolated. To shake hands with an executioner was to taint oneself with death. And yet when justice called, the same people who spat at them came running to watch. The executioner's work was part ritual, part performance. Each stroke of the blade, each tightening of the noose, had to serve two purposes: to punish the body and to warn the living. The most skilled among them were artisans of agony, trained to draw out suffering without allowing death too soon. They learned anatomy the way monks learned scripture, by practice, by failure, by the weight of screams, echoing through their sleep. Royal courts demanded precision. A messy execution was an insult to the crown. There are records of kings punishing their own headsmen for a single bad stroke, even as blood still dripped from the block. Some executioners carried their own swords, beautifully forged and inscribed with prayers, because even monsters needed something to believe in. But in the solitude of night, away from the spectacle, many were haunted by their craft. They drank heavily, confessed, endlessly, sought redemption that never came. Some claimed they heard the voices of those they had killed. Others found solace in the idea that they were not evil, only necessary. The kingdom needed its monsters, and they had simply agreed to wear the mask. In truth, the executioners were reflections of the very world they served, brutal, conflicted, and hollowed by guilt. Without them, royal wrath would have been powerless. With them, it became legend. They stood as the silent reminder that even divine authority depends on the hands of mortal men, and those hands were always stained. Centuries have passed since the last peasant was dragged to the scaffold, but the echoes of that age have never truly faded. The cruelty of medieval kings may be gone, yet the structures they built, the hierarchies, the blind obedience, the worship of power, still haunt us in quieter, subtler forms. The world learned to call tyranny by new names, but its spirit remains the same. When you walk through the ruins of old castles, it's easy to imagine the glory, banners, feasts, the shimmer of armor under torchlight. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear something beneath that illusion, the muffled cries of the forgotten, buried beneath centuries of dust. The Peasants' Rebellion was not just a moment in history. It was a mirror held up to humanity's darkest tendencies. And that reflection is timeless. Modern society likes to believe it has evolved beyond such brutality. Yet in the balance of power, between ruler and ruled, in the exploitation of the many for the comfort of the few, the ghosts of the medieval world still whisper. They remind us that oppression doesn't always need a crown. It only needs silence. Every system, every empire, every era has its peasants and its kings, its obedience and its fear. The Middle Ages were drenched in violence, but the true horror wasn't just in the executions or the blood-soaked fields. It was in the way entire generations accepted that suffering was normal, that cruelty was inevitable. That same danger exists now, whenever injustice becomes background noise, whenever we look away because the pain belongs to someone else. So the story doesn't end here. It lingers, in every monument, every sermon, every tradition born from obedience. The medieval kings are long dead, but their shadow still stretches across time, reminding us that fear is inherited, and freedom must always be fought for. If this journey through the darker corners of history moved you, leave a comment below with the phrase, "Even thrones can burn." Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the brutal truths behind our past, and watch our next video, where we uncover the night the Inquisition lost control.